This presentation is called Using Good and Beautiful Vocabulary, a homeschool parent's guide to better utilizing vocabulary with the Good and the Beautiful homeschool curriculum. I am a certified secondary English teacher, but because we're in the military, I've been homeschooling my children for the past 2 years. Consequently, we have more freedom to educate and travel where necessary. As I go through this presentation, please think about why you homeschool and what parts of this presentation about vocabulary can improve your homeschool. I use a curriculum called The Good and the Beautiful. It is a free homeschool curriculum, and their tagline is Making Homeschool Beautiful and Easy. I feel this curriculum adheres to this tagline. It is very beautiful and it is very easy to teach. I have met a lot of people who have started homeschooling because of the pandemic, so I wanted to help supplement their instruction with a video that gives a bit of help in teaching vocabulary in conjunction with the Good and the Beautiful curriculum. I have a busy household with a toddler and students in kindergarten, 2nd grade, and 3rd grade. The Good and the Beautiful boasts an open and go curriculum, meaning you don't have to spend a lot of time preparing lessons or gathering materials for lessons. They know that homeschool parents are busy, so they have catered to that dynamic. It is simple to teach and appropriately challenges our children. Some drawbacks to my instruction while using this open and go curriculum were I didn't prepare like I should. I hadn't really been using my teaching background to improve the quality of my children's education. And vocabulary lessons were missed because I was not prepared to teach them. So how do we enrich this wonderful curriculum? I'm going to show some strategies I've tried with my children. These examples use lessons from the Good and the Beautiful levels K through 3, language arts, and one example from level 2 math. As I get into these examples, you might think, why should we focus more on vocabulary? In response, this was an interesting thought from an article called Selecting Vocabulary Words to Teach English Language Learners. A student's maximum level of reading comprehension is determined by his or her knowledge of words. This word knowledge allows students to comprehend text. As a teacher, you can explicitly teach word meanings to improve comprehension. So, by emphasizing word knowledge, you can help your students' comprehension, and I would submit, consequently, their writing and fluency. These words can be taught through direct instruction, and they can be taught through reading. A study done by Ohio State University found that young children whose parents read them 5 books a day enter kindergarten having heard about 1.4 million more words than kids who were never read to. This million-word gap could be one key in explaining differences in vocabulary and reading development. It is so important to read with our students. Repeated exposure to words through reading improves comprehension. The Good and the Beautiful emphasizes the importance of reading. You'll notice that some of my examples demonstrate how to directly instruct while reading. This chart shows the development of early readers. There is such a large jump between ages 5 and 6. As we deliberately instruct our students in vocabulary, we can give depth to the breadth of words they are being exposed to in these formative years. I started this additional vocabulary instruction by administering some pre-tests that focused on fluency, comprehension, and writing. I found these resources from various sites that are listed at the end of this presentation. This helped us see where we were starting from. With all these pre-tests, I wanted to see where my students were, emphasize vocabulary a little bit more in the Good and the Beautiful lessons, and finally give these assessments again to see how my students had improved in fluency, comprehension, and writing. I'll show you each of these assessments that I gave to my students as examples for you to give to your students. These are the kindergarten pre-tests I administered. This test focused on fluency and comprehension. We kept track of how many of these words she read correctly and independently. Then she answered comprehension questions. Here's an example of a writing pretest you could give to your kindergartner. The Good and the Beautiful lessons will guide students to improve writing, but an emphasis on vocabulary should speed this development. This is the assessment I used for 2nd grade. We did a reader's theater even though he was the only one reading. This format gave us an opportunity to discuss Tier 2 or academic words and Tier 3 or domain-specific words. I'll explain these terms later on in the presentation. These are some of the notes I took on this assessment. Note the tiers of some of the words in this reading. This gave me a guide for how to teach these words he seemed not to understand. This is the reading fluency example. As you can see, with exposure, fluency improved. This is one of the benefits of repeated exposure to vocabulary words. My third grader took this fluency and writing pretest. Notice the improvement in fluency between the first and second reading. She then summarized the story and added more details after the second reading. For comprehension, my third grader was given this short story to read and then answered a few questions about it. Here are a few notes I took during this assessment. Again, I used these assessments as a starting point to guide my choices of activities we could do to supplement their vocabulary instruction. I've decided to show you some examples from specific lessons found in kindergarten, second, and third grade. I will show you one example from each of these grade levels for the following vocabulary strategies, and I'll define these as we get to them in the presentation. My first example I'd like to go through is word selection, which is essentially selecting the words you want to teach before you start teaching, and this can be done in 6 steps. Read your text selections in advance, keeping in mind what the lesson is seeking to teach. Then identify the words your students need to know. Connect the words your students need to know for this lesson or unit in your instructional purpose. Choose the words your students must know before they read, and which words incidentally don't need to be directly taught. And finally, determine what you want your children to learn. And as a bonus, make sure they're difficult enough. In a video on YouTube called 3 Tiers of Words by Mary Curtis explains that words can be separated into word tiers. Tier 1 words are those that are typical in elementary instruction, words like bus, store, baby. Tier 2 words cut across content areas, and we typically move into these tiers in secondary instruction. And Tier 3 words are domain specific, such as quadratic, isotope, peninsula. Thinking about these tiers will help you recognize which types of words you should be selecting to emphasize in your homeschool lessons. I found I taught a lot of Tier 1 words to my kindergartner, those vocabulary words that we use in typical conversation that she just doesn't know yet. Tier 2 words I taught more to my second and third grade students, as they were working more independently and needed to understand what words like analyze and formulate mean. While we did also learn some Tier 3 words as we were going through this vocabulary instruction, this level was not as common in my age group of students. So here are the examples of vocabulary instruction I did with my students that will hopefully give you some ideas for how you can instruct your students. The kindergarten example comes from the Good and the Beautiful Language Arts Lesson 7. First, on my own, I read the words she would be reading as part of this lesson. I noticed there was a word here she might not understand, yak. We talked about what yak was before I even presented this lesson to her, so that when she came to this word, she already knew its meaning and didn't have to guess how to match the word to the picture. She could just focus on reading the word, which is the intent of the lesson. For my second grader, I chose a Tier 2 word included in the independent practice portion of Lesson 4, where it said to answer the questions with complete sentences. I was not sure he knew what complete sentences meant. I asked him to give me examples of complete sentences, and when I felt like he knew what that word meant, he proceeded with the practice. My third grader's example comes from Lesson 88, where we used a little bit of semantic mapping in conjunction with word selection. Before we read through this poem, I picked out a few words I thought she might not know the meaning of and prepared myself to be able to teach and discuss those words with her. As we read through, I wanted her to pick out one word she did not know the meaning of. She chose tawny. On this semantic mapping paper, she was to write down the unknown word, say what she thought it meant, and specify the strategy she used to come up with this meaning. She used context clues to find meaning. When we looked it up, she wrote if it was correct or not, and then wrote the actual definition. As a side note, we used the definition of tawny later in that week as we drove by a field of wheat, and my other kids were not only exposed to the word, but I also realized that homeschool is such a great medium for experiences like this. We know what our children are learning, so we can quiz them on these things periodically. We ended up doing this semantic mapping activity with multiple poems from the Good and the Beautiful Level 3. This activity helped her to better understand the meaning of poems because she was able to pull out words she didn't understand, stop, take time to define them, then reread the poem with that added understanding. Moving on to Marzano's 6 steps of vocabulary instruction. He says that we can easily teach vocabulary if we follow these 6 steps. The first is to describe the word and then have the students restate that description in their own words. Then have them create some sort of representation of the word, which could be done in a notebook or other activities. Students can then discuss the words with others and finally play games that use these words. From Lesson 24 in the Kindergarten Language Arts book, I had my child play with the definition of the words in the poem Sunshine. I had her act out each line of this poem. It may seem simple, but moving her body was a fun way to help her define some words that were unknown. For example, when she said the line, "each blade of grass," she pretended to run her fingers up a blade of grass. That helped her to know what a blade of grass meant. For my 2nd grader, I took from Lesson 7 the word proper noun. As we discussed proper noun, I asked him to act out what proper meant, like in the sentence, "he is acting proper." He sat up straighter in his chair. He was more regal in his demeanor. This helped me explain to him that when we have proper nouns, they also stand up straight, which is why we capitalize them. This is a simple way to play games with vocabulary words. For Level 3, we decided to go over the challenging targeted spelling words before we even began the unit. I had my 3rd grader read the word, define it if she could, or look it up, then generate a sentence that used the word. The rest of the unit plays so many games with these words that I didn't have to come up with this type of supplementary material for spelling. The activity I did do with my 3rd grader before we began the unit employed the first 5 steps of Marzano's 6 steps. Because we completed this activity with all these spelling words, the first time I gave her this spelling test, she was able to spell these words more readily because she had definitions attached to them and had spent time looking at them instead of just completing a cold spelling test. Now we're going to move on to some pre-teaching examples. Pre-teaching is explicitly teaching a word before it is encountered in a lesson. You want to teach so the student can recall its meaning from memory. For my kindergartner, we did a similar activity to the one I just described with my 3rd grader. We went over the spelling words included in Unit 3 before we started the unit. I read the word to her first, then she wrote it down, then she told me a sentence that uses that word. Again, this is just exposing our children to these words so they can gain meaning and solidify spelling because they have the definition attached to those words. In Level 2, I have not yet reached this lesson, but I have selected the word barley to pre-teach. I'll provide an explanation of barley, then ask my son to describe barley. Then I'll have him draw a picture or act out a representation of the word and engage him in a writing activity focusing on this word, such as a sentence that uses the word barley. After all that pre-teaching, then we will have this lesson. When he gets to the part of the story where Barney spilled barley and honey all over the floor, he will know what that means. He will have a picture in his brain that he can attach to the word barley. When he gets to the comprehension questions, he won't be thinking, "What was barley again? I don't know what that word was." Instead, he'll be able to just tell me what happened in the story. My pre-teaching example in Level 3 was with our challenging word climbs. One thing the Good and the Beautiful has students do is read through words that are difficult but completely out of context. I found that my student had such a hard time remembering what these words were because she had no context for them. They were just thrown out there, hypocrite, chauffeur, herbal, with very few clues to help her know how to read it. I was handing her these words completely blind. She didn't know where to begin because they were so out of the ordinary. As she was attempting to read them, she didn't understand them and she got frustrated. I decided to start each new climb by reading her the word and she would repeat it. Then I would use it in a sentence. If she knew the definition once she heard the word, she'd volunteer her own sentence. She passed off the climbs we started with this activity far faster than those we did not. When she encountered the words, she now had context for them. She knew what they meant. She had spent time learning the vocabulary so that when she came upon the words to read them, she could easily remember what they were and the nuances that existed in these challenging word climbs. Next, we have morphology, which is the decoding of words using prefixes, roots, and suffixes. The Good and the Beautiful curriculum does a great job exposing our students to prefixes, roots, and suffixes. Morphology is a more technical term for learning the parts of a word, as shown here. In my kindergartner's lesson, we jumped to lessons 80 and 82 to practice the suffixes ing and ed. For our morphology lesson, I had my student pick 3 words that had these endings. She chose look, fix, and help. She wrote these words on the tops of the butterflies we cut out. On the bottoms of the 2 butterflies of the same color, she added either the ending ing or ed. Then we discussed how these suffixes made the words different, but how the roots made them the same. She learned the meanings of the words by writing the parts down in a more visual manner. For level 2, this is my one example that comes from the Good and the Beautiful math curriculum. When we learned how to count by 3s, the lesson started out with the triangle. I asked my son to tell me what a triangle was. He explained that it was a shape that had 3 sides. We talked about how the word could be broken down, triangle, 3 angles. Then we thought of other words that used the prefix tri, and he came up with tricycle, and realized that meant 3 wheels. Finally, we looked at triceratops, which means 3-horned face, so he concluded that tri meant 3. He also offered the word tryout. We spelled that one out and discovered that it didn't have the same prefix tri, so its definition would not match. While this morphology minute was just an introduction to our math lesson, it got him thinking about the number 3 and springboarded us into the rest of the lesson. In level 3, I took an idea from the article called 15 Ways to Teach Prefixes and Suffixes, wherein the authors offer a whiteboard sort. First, I modeled what I was expecting. I didn't expect her to write down all the words in this lesson because that would make the lesson be far too long. For this activity, I just decided to do 5 words, which was enough for her to solidify the meaning of pre and tella. For each of these 5 words, I had her divide each part of the word onto these whiteboards, and then we discussed their meanings. Through this activity, she discovered that every word does not have a suffix, and consequently every word does not have a prefix. This activity helped her to visualize how words can be broken up depending on their prefixes and suffixes. Semantic mapping is a way for students to visually map word concepts through graphics. For my kindergartner in lesson 68, we mapped out the word cave before she did the lesson. I read her definition, which is written at the top of this page. Then she gave me her definition in her own words, a hole that lives by a cliff. Then I had her write a synonym for the word cave, hole. She gave me a sentence, a bear lives in a cave. Then she drew a picture of a cave. Now when she completes lesson 68, she will know what a cave is, and she can circle the sentence that is true without wondering, what's a cave? She can more readily complete this assignment because she has the vocabulary knowledge to back it up. In semantic mapping for level 2, I again used this figuring out unknown words worksheet. In lesson 3, my 2nd grader was to read this story. A word he didn't know was miss. He thought about what it meant and put another name for a girl, which is true. But this activity taught him an additional meaning to the word miss. He used strategy 4 and 5, which was using a word he knew and a synonym. We discussed that the second meaning of miss was a girl who is not married. Was he right? Yes. Did we go deeper into the definition? Yes. Now he has moved into a deeper realm of understanding, so when he reads this story about Miss Green, he understands that she is a girl, but also a girl who is not married. Another form of semantic mapping is the Freyer model, which I also used in the kindergarten example. This is the model my 3rd grader completed as we discussed the word bade. She gave a description of the word. She chose to write a sentence to show what bade meant. She drew a picture where she is calling her sister to come to her, and her non-example is a sentence, I make mom come. We discussed how bade means asking, not forcing. Because she learned the definition of this word, the poem, The Use of Flowers, had a much deeper meaning for her, where in the first line it says, God might have bade the earth to bring forth enough for great and small. She realized that God wasn't forcing these things to happen, but rather asking in the past tense, which gave her a greater understanding for the character of God in this particular poem. Now that you have seen some activity examples, how do you select activities that are appropriate for your students? To help answer that question, I wanted to talk for a minute about the similarities between early readers and English language learners. While most homeschoolers are probably not teaching English language learners, or ELLs, understanding their stages of development can guide the instruction of our K-2 students. The IRIS Center has said, when a teacher is able to identify a student's stage of English language proficiency, he or she can plan instruction to meet the language needs of that student. Language acquisition happens in stages. As I go over these stages, you can exchange the word understand for read, and many of the values will translate, which should help us determine what developmental stage our student is at and what strategies for instruction we can employ to help them develop. Please note that my early reader suggestions are in parentheses on this next slide. According to the IRIS Center, the first stage is receptive. ELLs are just starting to understand, and early readers are just starting to read about 500 words, yet they're still unsure of many of those words. In stage 2, ELLs are beginning to use 1 to 2 word responses, and early readers are writing those 1 to 2 word responses. In stage 3, speech starts to emerge. ELLs use short sentences to respond, and early readers start writing short sentences. By stage 4, these students have gained confidence in responses and written for our early readers. And in stage 5, we have advanced language proficiency with fluency and occasional mistakes. Now with your early reader, you can see what stage he or she is in and choose activities for this stage to guide your instruction. For your stage 1 students, visuals, acting out or role-playing, and songs can guide your instruction. Stage 2 learners would benefit from direct instruction in simple sentences with proper grammar. Stage 3 learners can start to use graphic organizers and practice writing while giving limited corrections so these learners don't become overwhelmed with all the corrections that need to be made because their language is still developing. And in stage 4, you can choose activities that will help develop their argument and expression skills. With the vocabulary lesson examples found in this presentation, I differentiated my instruction according to age, ability, and current progress of my students. As homeschool parents, we have the time to differentiate our instructions. We can easily see areas in which our children excel and areas where they need more emphasis. So when you choose your vocabulary activities, be sure to differentiate. Another option when choosing your own vocabulary activities is to choose some that focus on your students' natural intelligences. Based on Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, we all have areas that we are more inclined to excel in. You can use this graphic to help you determine which areas your students may be drawn to, and then choose activities that fit within these intelligences. For example, if you have a child who is drawn to spatial intelligence, graphic organizers might be a good option. If your child has bodily kinesthetic intelligence, acting out and role-playing should be enjoyable for them, and so forth. So how has a focus on vocabulary changed our homeschool? I am more prepared to teach and answer questions because I look at the lessons before I start them. I've kind of let go of that open and go policy a little bit. I'm more prepared to answer questions and guide my children's reading. The Good and the Beautiful does a great job lining out where they are going to go with their curriculum by providing a table of contents. An emphasis on vocabulary helped me to be more prepared so that I could teach my children what they needed to know before we even got to those lessons, which ultimately led to greater success. We are going deeper into the material now. We spend more time learning why and learning how because we're discussing vocabulary that makes our learning so much richer. Our reading has improved. Through things such as morphology and semantic mapping, my students are exposed to words they understand more frequently. This improves the retention of those words and has improved their fluency. We take our time developing mastery. If it takes us a little bit longer to get through the lessons, that is okay. We are going deeper into our knowledge of vocabulary, which will ultimately enrich all our education. My children will comprehend and understand instruction far better because we are mastering language. So what are the next steps for my children in our homeschool? I would like to conduct those same assessments that I did at the beginning of our vocabulary instruction again after I've completed the year for my students. One benefit of taking the same assessment is showing my students how they have progressed in fluency, writing, and comprehension. My hope is that this presentation has given you some ideas for how you can take the Good and the Beautiful curriculum and deepen the level of understanding for your children through a richer vocabulary instruction.